I'm going to talk about some recent experiences that tackle best practices. And I was daunted by what Dr. Daniels said about so many people feel there's fraud in research. My experience is that investigators intend to do the right thing, and they want to be transparent, and it's the outlier that does fraudulent data in all my experiences, maybe through some of the pressures she mentioned, but I think they forget, or they haven't been trained maybe to report everything. So my own personal interest has been in documentation and reporting of things important to nutrition. Oh, there, oops, it had worked, a little delayed. So the importance of documentation. If you didn't document it, it didn't happen, or it might as well not have happened, because you can't prove this is what we did, this is the protocol, and then you have to report it to your audiences to know that you did it. And there's so many exceptions we're going to talk about in nutrition research beyond the normal randomized controlled trial to consider that are important to get the details so you know exactly what was compared and to reproduce the work. So this space of thinking about how to best design trials and some reporting is not completely new. In fact, I wanted to point out that ILSI's been a player for a long time in this space. And so one consensus view that was led by ILSI Europe resulted in this publication in the bottom by Welch et al. It aimed at strengthening evidence base for health claims, and that was by appealing to be more specific about nutrition and consort, but it didn't cover the whole diet. And so these newer efforts are to deal with the whole diet, supplements, bioactive ingredients, or behavioral education interventions, the whole range of diet-related diseases. So the first effort that I participated in that I'll talk about are best practices for design and conduct and reporting and documenting of human nutrition randomized controlled trials. This work has resulted in an online course that's being offered by the American Society for Nutrition that I'm going to explain more about. The backdrop of this is the people who got together to develop these guidelines believed that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for development of evidence-based recommendations. In fact, that's widely thought to be the case, that it's the strongest kind of evidence. And if you don't have enough rigor and reporting accuracies behind that evidence, then you have a weaker evidence base to form policies related to diet and nutrition. So weaker studies undermines the confidence in this dietary guidance. So our goal is to have the best evidence, the most rigorous, transparent, best designed evidence to underpin policies that would influence the masses. So we also knew there were efforts, bits and pieces of the whole gamut of best practices in the literature, but not thought through from beginning to end, and not all assembled in one place that you could go to. And so we got busy and worked for quite a while on publications. Our working group we called NOURISH, Nutrition Intervention Research, using some of the letters in there. And we started out through the NIH-funded Clinical and Translational Science Awards. There's 60 of them in the US, and we reached out to all the PIs of these 60 and said, if you have a major nutrition component with a researcher invested in nutrition in your CTSA, they're called, would you put us in touch with them And then we invited them and invited American Society for Nutrition to partner with us to a workshop that was held at Tufts University. And we formed working groups to tackle these various aspects, to develop best practices and then publish them. So here's the committee of those who ended up being identified through the CTSA or through American Society of Nutrition, who assembled and became the working group and divided up to write the different guidelines in the papers. So that's resulted in 5 papers. They're all advances, published in Advances in Nutrition at the end of 2021 to the beginning of, well, pretty much all in 2021. I guess one of them was published at the end of 2020. But it goes through all the pieces. So the design and conduct of the trials, documentation and regulation of trials, laboratory considerations and data management of the trials, and then reporting and conducting statistical analysis of trials. So ASN then has developed these trainings into webinars so that it's not just in papers that people are left to try to find on the shelf, but we're training, especially the younger generation who are coming up, learn the best ways possible early in your career before you begin your trials. So now these trainings are getting adopted. I've seen so many places where people are writing grant proposals, especially the early career type awards, mentoring and K awards and whatnot, where they say, one of my goals is to take one of these ASN webinars to learn best practices. And I hope, Philip, that FINS will adopt this sort of implementation with the work that FINS is doing to educate the community and try to get it implemented. So we have developed these 2-day webinars that anybody can take, and the faculty are largely overlapping with the authors of the 5 papers, but we brought in a few more people. And so these are the faculty of the webinars. And the desired impact is by developing and training best practices in all aspects of human nutrition randomized control trials and make this comprehensive resource publicly available. We hope to increase the rigor, the evidence base that forms policies for dietary guidance. Our hope is that the dialogue for improving rigorous nutrition research to inform policy will be ongoing and dynamic and updated and not just set in time. So the webinars are 2 days covering some of the papers in day 1 on the design and conduct of the randomized control trials, and also a session on documentation and regulation. And then day 2 is the laboratory management and statistical analysis plans and reporting of the clinical nutrition study. So the first 2-day workshop was held in July of 2021, and the next one is coming right away, July 12th and 14th. So you can get online for this year-round learning experience that American Society of Nutrition is offering. It's available for registration right now. So communicate with your colleagues and your students and trainees that this hopefully would be a very useful experience. And it's more lively and engaging because there's breakout sessions at the end of every day than just reading the papers. So that's one aspect, and probably because of my involvement with that, I got nominated to join the European group of FINS on efforts that Philip has led as president. And he's going to give you the overview of all of the rigor that he's trying to bring through working groups. And I'm going to elaborate on just one of the working groups that I'm involved in that deals with scientific reporting, because that's my area of interest right now. So towards improving reporting guidelines for nutrition studies, here is the very international working group that's been assembled to consider best practices for reporting guidelines of nutrition research. I'm sure you'll recognize many of those names. So I borrowed a few slides from Anne-Marie Menahaney, who's one of the members who's done an earlier presentation on this work, including this one. And so the question we're asking, would the availability and adoption of consort nutrition guidelines, an extension of the regular consort, lead to a more consistent, transparent, and granular reporting of nutrition randomized controlled trials so that they're better interpreted? And if you have these guidelines, then people will think about them in the design of their trials. So CONSORT stands for Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials, developed by the CONSORT group that's ruled by Equator. And so we're in conversations with Equator to consider a nutrition extension of this consort. So one of the components of consort that you need to have in manuscripts that adopts the consort is this flow diagram. So just to give you an example, is we look at all the pieces to say, what do we need to elaborate on for reporting nutrition specifically? Consort's adopted by 585 journals. The nutrition related ones are listed here. So it's all your big top nutrition journals. There's a few at the bottom that haven't yet joined the club, but we hope that they will, because improved reporting improves the evidence base, improves the policies that depend on that. So the idea is consort statement has 25 items, and for the journals that adopt it, the authors have to submit where in the paper are you going to find these things that they specifically want you to make sure you reported. And so what nutrition extension would do is take the ones that we think need elaboration or description on specifically for nutrition. All 25 don't need elaborated on, but some do. So this is an example of the kinds of things we've been doing. So nutrition, for example, blinding is a big issue with nutrition intervention trials that isn't with other trials. I mean, it's really hard to disguise a blueberry intervention, for example, the color, So how do you do that? And if you can't blind the actual intervention, you can blind other parts of it. You can blind the people who are analyzing the outcome measures. And so you need to be thinking, how can you build in blinding all the way along and explain then in the paper what you've done? What is the comparator? Too often, you just heard an example from Dr. Daniels of the comparator you could think is inert for the main primary outcome measure that you're doing. But now that you're adding on metabolomics or the microbiome, some of the things you have in your comparator aren't really placebos anymore. They turn out to be substrates for the microbiomes. They're inert fibers maybe that can shift the profile of the microbiome. So you need to be very careful and report exactly what your comparators are. That's just sort of an example of what we're doing. So we've developed a list of the consort items that could benefit from nutrition-specific expansions. 16 of the 25 items were identified. And now we're taking some classic nutrition trials and we're evaluating them against this extension list that we've developed. And you would be surprised at some of the most famous trials up here that give you no clue what the comparator placebo was, what it had in it. Did it look like the intervention so that it was blinded? There's no statement about that. and just on so forth on down the list. Who was blinded? How was it blinded? These basic things that are fundamental to be able to reproduce or interpret the data. So we're in the process of writing an opinion paper. Now that we've identified the items, we're in the process of evaluating these studies to show what could be improved, even with really famous, impactful studies. And Equator is waiting for this opinion paper to be published before they update the guidelines for consort. And we've got the paper accepted. Jessica Rizzuto is going to present at IUNS in Japan in December. So even if we get our opinion paper draft done a little early, we're going to wait until the fall so it won't scoop this publication in IUNS. We're trying to imagine how to engage the community. So we're having a town hall kind of meeting or a cafe roundtable at IUNS to get people's interactions and input into these consort extension proposals that we make. And we envision having discussions with key nutrition journal editors and others to make this as implementable as we possibly can. So that summarizes what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie, for that, reassuring us that things are happening out there to put things straight, actually. Thank you for that. Would we have any questions? 2 questions? Gosh, there's 3 actually, 3 and 4. All right. Bushra, I think I saw your hand first, yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm actually a psychologist by training. And what is now happening in the field of psychology is something beyond like what happens in nutrition, where before conducting a clinical trial, you have to register it, for instance, on clinicaltrials.gov, etc. So I do this in all my studies, but what we do in psychology is we actually write the introduction for quite a lot of journals that are coming up right now. We write the introduction, we write the methods, those get submitted to the journal, undergo peer review, and when you get the green light for that, then you get to conduct your study. And regardless of the results, as long as you have done exactly what you said you would do, your results will get published. So what do you think about that, adopting that kind of format into the nutrition field?
So it's working its way into nutrition. So there are some journals that you can publish designs like contemporary clinical trials and others. And there's some journals that will allow some pre-publication. We do have an editor in the room, so can I ask you to comment on that? Can you bring the microphone to? So I want to specifically ask, aren't there some journals that would think that's pre-publication is not allowed yet?
Well, at least, well, nutrition reviews is very different because we are only review articles. So, but we do have some same issues about retracted papers that are part of review articles. And so there's all those still ethical issues, even within a review journal. There is something, I think it's British Medical Journal protocols, which you can then submit your protocols and you publish your protocols before you do your trial. I think those is another good avenue to get that out there. Then you have your protocol paper, and then 2 years later you might end up with your results. I think the other piece about what I was going to ask you, I'm going to, now that I have the mic, I might take the opportunity. But I think that getting the protocols out there first is important. I don't know if the prevention of publishing the protocols, let's say your protocol is not accepted. I mean, you probably got funded to do the research.
No, I mean a pre-publication.
Well, we do allow pre-publications to come into our journal, but we do hope then that it gets dropped off the pre-publication list. But pre-publications are an issue because I think you saw the number of retractions after COVID. A lot of pre-publications, there was a lot more retractions with all those papers coming up. So I think that is an issue. It does bypass peer review. It's sort of like writing white papers. Organizations write papers, they get cited, but they've never really been reviewed.
It seems like the publication of your design and protocol is too late to make changes in the study, because by the time you submit it, you're well on your way in data collecting. So unless we go to some sort of online ability to give input, it's too late for that study anyway.
Sorry, I have to stop this conversation if you don't mind. We can always, have it. It's very interesting. I have a lot of questions too. Maybe I can take one more. There were 3 hands. Who wants to put up their hand? Alan.
I know Alan had one.
Alan has one. Luis and okay, Alan, very quickly. Alan first, and then Luis, maybe.
So Connie, I very much appreciate this effort that you're involved in to try to improve the quality and reporting of randomized controlled trials for nutrition research. But I wanted to ask your view on a sort of contradictory direction that is emerging, which is there are some epidemiologists who argue that we should not be regarding the randomized controlled trial as the gold standard, and are pushing for giving greater weight to simple observational studies because they provide a piece of the puzzle. Now, whilst one can see the logic of that, the concern I have is that it then downgrades, to some extent, your tremendous efforts to try to improve quality and reporting of these important trials.
Well, I've always learned that observational studies are hypothesis generating, but not able to establish cause and effect. Now, there's some modern approaches that get closer, like Mendelian randomization. And let's talk about that later online, their limitations. But I think there's still a huge place for randomized controlled trials.
Yes, thank you. Luis?
Connie, you mentioned it very briefly, but and I noticed that lots of parts of the proposal is to look at the statistical analysis of data. We know that Predimed was retracted and reanalyzed because of failure to randomize appropriately. The other thing as a psychologist is that the biggest predictor of future behavior and therefore response to trial is very often past behavior. And Hanny touched on that in her talk when she said, one of the features that influences response to treatment in her example was body weight. And I think one of the things that I find is missing is a really sophisticated understanding of things like baseline, which will actually account for more variance in the trial very often than the actual effect. And I think, I've been writing about this for years in psychology, but it's only recently that other psychologists start to take into account things like baseline cognitive function.
You're absolutely right. And we spend a great deal of time on describing baseline, not only for how it might affect the intervention, but as part of the statistical analysis plan in these efforts.
And I think it has to go hand in hand with better training in statistics.
Absolutely.
For people doing those trials, or the involvement of a proper statistician.
Absolutely. A priori statistical analysis plan is one of the top recommendations out of the ASN webinar effort.
And there are some great papers on how people have been fishing afterwards.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, thank you.